Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so we will resume now from where we left off before lunch, and that's on viability. So I think I was going to move on next to North East Thatcham Partnership and just let them briefly outline their position on viability. Obviously, I've seen the Appendix 9 to the matter statement, which was basically a review of the Dixon Sill work that had been done. And maybe you could just say a few words about that and what it tells us. So it looked at the 1,500 scheme and basically agreed, I think, with the Dixon Sill conclusions. Although I think some of the figures are slightly different in terms of this surplus over the benchmark land value, having factored in all the costs. But then there were some points about the assumptions made about infrastructure costs that have been factored in, and this has been referred to, I think, by Mr. Black, some statement about those looking rather low. Hence sensitivity testing to look at different scenarios with a larger amount of development and what that would mean for the generation of funding for infrastructure. So that's basically the approach I think that was taken. But do you want to just talk
yes,
a bit about that?
We won't take too long. So you're absolutely right in what you say. Mr. Hegan from Turner Moorham is here, sitting to my left. So I'll ask him to deal with most of these points. But so you asked, you indicated in that question, sir, obviously the position in relation to viability of a scheme at 2,500, or indeed, at least 2,000, not at issue. Obviously, we're not making a point about that. There's plainly the evidence is there to show that they would be viable and would be able to bring forward all of the things that the scheme is aimed at. In relation to the 1,500, the headline, for the reasons that Mr. Hegan will touch on, is that there are some issues, many of which arise because of the way that it wasn't, I think retrofitted is the wrong expression, but the changeover from the 2,500 to 300 has caused certain issues for the viability exercise. And our work is aimed at exploring whether the fragility that one finds potentially in that work is really necessary in this situation. So I'll pass over to Mr. Hegan, who can cover, I think, a couple of the points that you raised, sir.
Yeah, so if you could just, I suppose, highlight any differences of opinion you have with the Dixon Sill analysis. And I think the most relevant one, if I'm mistaken, well, maybe you just clarify this, in terms of the scenario that you looked at various scenarios, but in table 2G, which is the one that was referred to by Vincent's Lane, that's 40% affordable housing and 17.5% profit. That's a sort of base sort of scenario, and that factors in all of the SP17 requirements and your latest update to the build costs, market values, but taking the IDP infrastructure costs as given because you hadn't got any further information. So that's broadly it. And just tell me, it's set out in a number of different ways. What does that tell you at the sort of the comfort is, or the surplus is, in terms of the comparison of the overall development value, net development value against the benchmark land value?
Okay, thank you.
Which figure am I looking at in these tables in 2G?
So that table 2G, which is Appendix 3 to our Stage 2 work completed in 2022. So autumn of 22, we completed that. There are two tables there which display the range of residual land value. So that's the appraisal results. The top table set does it in pound terms, absolute terms. So what does the appraisal drop out as a big number? Then beneath that, that's converted into a pound per hectare equivalent for ease of comparison with the benchmark land value level. So our base case scenario, which is no sensitivity test to the base value assumption, no sensitivity test to the cost rate assumption, so a 0% increase or decrease to those. Where we thought values were at the time, going down the middle column, so the bold figures are the sort of key figures that we've sought to emphasise there. And I think you picked up, sir, on the 305,000 approximately residual land value result flowing from all the assumptions we made, which is in round terms sort of £54,000 above the benchmark land value level that we've relied on. So that's £54,000 per hectare across the 170 odd hectares. That we're the right side of the viability cusp, if I can put it like that. So the purpose of this table really, I mean, our work, the reporting, the written work explains the nature of the exercise, and that, you know, estimates that we make could be high, they could be low. What we're trying to do is it's a high level, a broad assessment, proportionate to the nature of the exercise, etc., as per the guidance. But it's useful for wider information to then sensitivity test those base outputs to see what the effect of values moving either side, costs going either way. And we've even run that, as you will see, at 30% affordable housing as well, as a sort of wider set of information. So what those tables are showing are how broadly the effect of reducing cost, increasing cost, reducing value, increasing value may impact when taken in an effect in isolation or in combination when you read off from those grids. So broadly speaking, you can see how the residual land value appraisal result gets higher, so improves, indicates better viability as costs fall. It indicates declining viability as costs rise. And similarly, as values fall, you can see the numbers reducing. As values increase, the numbers increase. So it's to give an expanded set of what ifs, really, within which this could all settle down. We're not saying it absolutely will, because, you know, we've heard about the nature of the beast, the amount of detail that needs to be looked into before there's a design scheme which can be appraised, etc. But it's a set of what ifs to give a feel for how strong or otherwise the viability is and how sensitive it is at those base levels to varying inputs on value, cost, profit level, affordable housing, etc.
Okay, thank you. So picking up from there, then, if we could just say, you know, you looked at that, and I think it was, well, you showed me what you know, any significant differences in what you've found, but.
So I'm Tom Hegan, partner of Turner Moorham, specialist viability consultant and expert witness valuer. As you would have seen, we've considered the Dixon Searle analysis. Just a minor point of clarification. I noted you referenced the table 2G. The one that I've focused on within my analysis is table 2H. Which is indeed, and the only variance between the conclusions within those respective tables is the developer profit allowance that's applied to the market housing. But the table 2H figures have a slightly higher allowance for profit, which results in a slightly lower residual land value. And you'll see within the table 2H that there's a figure in the middle, the second table down, which is 4.7 million. And that is essentially the viability surplus.
And that's what you refer to as viability surplus in your.
Exactly right.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. Okay, I've got that. Yeah, thanks.
And so that's effectively almost like a bit of a headroom figure. Mr. Dixon and Mr. Searle, we regularly discuss what is an appropriate allowance for profit, and we have sort of slightly different views on that. But one can say that the answer is somewhere between the 4.7 and the 9.3 in 2G. So what I did within my analysis is I sort of effectively rebuilt the DSP appraisals in my own format so I could analyse them, the conclusions and form a view on them. And generally speaking, I was content that the approach and the inputs that were adopted by DSP were appropriate. You know, I accept that the point discussed before lunch about no indexation being applied on some of the strategic infrastructure costs, but I felt that the 4.7 million of headroom, you know, meant that essentially the conclusions that the scheme at that level is technically viable remain the case. But what I then went on to do was essentially model 2 further schemes with more dwellings included, going up to 2,500 dwellings, and effectively what it concluded was that the larger the scheme, the bigger the pot for sort of Section 106, SIL, BNG infrastructure, as one would expect. My analysis concluded that for a scheme of 2,500, there was effectively £81 million worth of additional monies that would be available for sort of that comprehensive planning gain pot. And that included, you know, the Section 106 costs and the SIL costs being applied on a sort of consistent rate per dwelling basis with the 1,500 unit scheme. And you might find that in reality, as the scheme gets bigger, the Section 106 requests would reduce, and that would mean that there would be more in the pot for infrastructure, essentially. So I think what my analysis sort of reinforced is that the bigger the scheme, you know, the more it could afford in infrastructure. The other issue is not necessarily a viability point, it's more of a delivery one in relation to education, particularly the secondary school, is that if it's a larger scheme, then it can sort of consume its own smoke in terms of what it delivers in the secondary school. It's not reliant upon contributions from other schemes in order to deliver that secondary school on site. Whereas if it's a 1,500 unit scheme, it's got to deliver a secondary school. I wouldn't say it can't be done, but it's really complicated if the delivery of that school is then contingent upon the sort of consortium group securing contributions from other developments when there's no certainty as to when those developments are going to come forward, and or whether, you know, the Section 106 contributions will be secured. You know, there are ways in which you can deal with it, but it sometimes involves the council stepping in to forward fund it. You know, sometimes it requires the developers to pay more towards delivery, but then they're at risk that they won't secure the deferred contributions from schemes which may or may not come forward. So yeah, it's complicated. Whereas if it's a 2,500 scheme, I think, you know, those sorts of issues go away. And then I suppose the only final point is that whilst the approach that was adopted to the 1,500 watt a unit scheme on the infrastructure costs, the strategic infrastructure costs that were included within that appraisal were effectively based upon the originally modelled scheme for 2,500 units, and they were adjusted pro rata for the 1,500. I think that was, you know, given where we were at the time, that was probably the correct approach. But what we can say with more certainty is that the cost for the 2,500 unit scheme, you know, were correct and appropriate, and you know, any concerns about viability are again somewhat alleviated as the scheme gets larger in size. There's a bigger buffer to protect the scheme.
Yeah, understood. And just for clarity, you say that the 2,500 scheme would deliver around 81 million for infrastructure.
Additionally to infrastructure, so 141. So it's 79 million in infrastructure alone, but 141 million in infrastructure 106 SIL and BNG.
What does that compare to in the 1,500? Is that comparable to the 23 million or something else?
So for the 1,500 unit scheme appraisal, you've got 23 million allowed for infrastructure. So that's a 56 million pound uplift if the scheme goes to 1,000 units. So it goes up significantly.
Yeah. So that's the extra bonus that you get for the infrastructure between the two schemes.
Yeah, effectively, the way I've worked that out is you run the appraisal with a consistent level of infrastructure with the 1,500, and then you work out the headroom that you've got to get back to a zero surplus deficit position. So the amount of costs increase to get you to that. It's like a goal seek calculation to work out what the scheme could technically afford towards additional infrastructure, section 106 and SIL. And as I say, yeah, it's in overall terms, the whole planning gain pot would increase by approximately £81 million to 141 million.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Anything else you want to say at this stage? No, okay, thank you. Any other points on viability then that you've got in terms of, you've heard the explanation there and the extra? Well, I think the basic message there is that 1,500 is viable. It's getting close to marginal, I suppose, depending on where things go. And what it does show is that a larger amount of housing will be providing greater certainty about the funding being available for the strategic infrastructure. That's the basic point.
Exactly right.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's fine, councillor.
Thank you, sir. If I understood correctly, the previous speaker suggested that the larger site, 2,500, would be viable for secondary school and education. As you know, already noted, the evidence yesterday said that neither of those would be viable for either for 1,500 or for 2,500 houses as a self-contained unit. They would require they need to be bigger than the site would justify. And in fact, basic arithmetic. If we were talking about a sixth form campus that was suggested in the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study, I think the number of pupils would actually fit better with the number of pupils that would be generated by a 1,500 site than a 2,500 site. So in that case, it might be easier to accommodate secondary provision with the smaller site because it just matches better the size you need for a sixth form campus. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Black.
Thank you, sir. I think one of the things that we've got is that North East Thatcham Partnership is saying that 1,500 would be viable. What we heard before was that as part of that, effectively the costs of things like the school, there's a higher burden to the council for investing in that. So I think whilst they're saying that's viable, you also need to hear from the council that investment make up for the school provision is viable and that funding is available as well. Because effectively that 1,500 unit one place is a lot more burden on the council. Conscious that I'm teeing up a kick into the corner for the North East Thatcham here, but that does provide a kind of bit of a quandary. The other bit was just on going back on sewage, and I don't want to go back on this point, but I was looking again over lunch, and in the development statement from North East Thatcham Partnership, it talks about water and foul sewage, and it says that will be met through investment by Thames Water. So again, there's effectively an assumption that all that requirement is going to be met by Thames Water.
Isn't that the normal process?
Well,
no.
Not currently, because they don't have any money.
Well, no, leaving aside their financial situation that's in the news, isn't it?
Not for a large development. If you're talking about a significant development that needs foul sewage treatment to be worked through which would be significant for this amount of units, Thames Water won't pay for that.
Okay.
That's a development cost.
Okay.
But North East Thatcham Partnership are assuming that that's going to be met by Thames Water.
Okay, well, we'll get
That's one of those other elements of infrastructure and early delivery and timely.
I mean, going back to what you're saying about the school and indeed for the health centre, it was clarified yesterday that the developer would not fund all of those because they're over and above what is needed to provide for the future residents. So there's a question mark about what that is, and I'm aware of that, and there's something I might need further information and clarification about. So, but that is the case in terms of the viability assessment. Is it that the total cost of the secondary school and the health centre was or was not factored in? I don't know, I'll look at both of you. Or rather, it just assumed a cost to the developer rather than the total cost of those bits of infrastructure.
I'll have to check that. So, I mean, I'll need to go back and remind myself.
Mr.
what
Dixon,
did assumed.
Likewise, sir, but I think particularly on the secondary school, the cost that's in there as an assumption is not the whole cost. I think it's land plus a contribution to build.
And that's the way it was described yesterday as the what the
Yes,
policy was.
Which is, and then that links into the need for the feasibility assessment to
Yeah.
work out what's actually required.
And the council said quite clearly that it would require other sources of funding to bridge that gap.
I believe so.
Yeah, okay, that's fine, that's understood.
Mr. Egan, just clarify what the position is on the assessment.
The 2,500 unit scheme included an assumption that 50% of the 8th form entry secondary school would be funded by the scheme.
50% of an 8th form
50% of
entry.
an 8th form entry, yeah.
Okay.
And then there would be, in terms of primary schools, a 2 form entry school and a 3 form entry school, from what I can tell, wholly funded by the development itself, again at 2,500 units.
Can I just to follow up on that? So those costs and that school provision is consistent with the growth study. So the total primary school cost in the growth study was 22.7 million, albeit with an education requirement based on 2,500, and the secondary school cost was 26.4 million, of which the assumption was development pays 50%. So that if you keep the 26.4 and the 22.7 in mind, albeit the primary school will be smaller, my understanding of the Dixon Searle assessment is that there's 28.3 million in total for section 106, including education.
Understood, thank you. Right, anything else on viability? Let me just check if I've got anything else. No, okay, right. So let's move on then to. Well, actually, sorry, just before, I mean, I had another question under this heading, didn't I, about is it necessary to modify the plan to, let me just check what it was now. I think I know what the answers to this are, but. Yeah, the question was, could more than 1,500 dwellings be satisfactorily accommodated on the North East Thatcham site, meeting all the requirements for SP 17? And if so, is it necessary to modify the reference in SP 17 to refer to a different scale of development? Well, clearly we know what the differences are. Your position is that it's 1,500. That's what it should be. It's viable at that stage, and the development area is what it is intended to accommodate. So there's no sort of ambiguity about that.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Could you just add though, sir, forgive me, before you move on?
Yeah.
I think strictly speaking, the answer to your question from not just the partnership, but from the council to the question you're asking is, yes, the site can do 2,500 units and deliver the objectives. I don't think that point, I know that there's a difference between us about whether it should be 2,500 or 1,500, but there's no cases, as it were, being run by the council that there's a problem in planning or delivery terms with 2,500 units.
Well, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I can only point out and reiterate, the decision was made to alter the quantum of development based on strength of local objection. And that's the main issue.
Yeah, I think what the partners were saying, that the evidence that the plan was based on essentially the Thatcham growth study showed the potential for up to that amount. I think that's your point, is it?
It is, and,
Yeah.
again, I'm not in the business of putting the council on the spot, but I think the shared position is that I know that a political decision's been taken, but 2,500 units could come forward on the site. And of course, you know, planning and the NPPF isn't a popularity contest. It's about what's right in terms of soundness.
Okay, we'll move on anyway. But the other point is that if a scheme were to be brought forward for more than 1,500, and it does say around 1,500, but if it was significantly more than that, you get to a point where it wouldn't be a matter of judging whether it would still meet all of the other requirements of SP 17. It would come to a point where you say, well, that quantum is something that is not in accordance with policy SP 17. At what point that would be reached, i.e. it's not around 1,500. At some point before you got to 2,500, you may say, well, that's not actually what this plan is proposing, presumably. Yeah. So if further development were to be, in that situation, if further development were to be brought forward on the site, and you've explained that the way the policy is now framed and the development area is defined and the green infrastructure provision that would be designed would be to end any ambiguity about that, it would create a master plan that would be clear about that is it and that's where it's stopping. Yeah, but if that were to change, it would be through a plan review rather than through a sort of variation or flexibility in the application of this policy. You're nodding, and so I think
that's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the only other point, so just forgive me, on that is it doesn't sit obviously with the council's own capacity exercise that they've used with us. Because if that is 1,750 and then housing in the local centres, another 200 or thereabouts, potentially across 3 centres, that's 1,950. Is that something that the council is at the same time saying would be too much in relation to the 1,500? You can see immediately there are problems with the evidence base and what's being said.
So what was a 1,750?
That was the 35 DPH times 50.
Oh, that was yours.
Yeah, I mean, that was the council's evidence today as to how they've arrived at the developable area, which is obviously potentially, some would think, it's a matter of judgment, but materially more than the 1,500. And so if that's what's actually developable at the same density that the council is taking into account, doesn't that cause a bit of a fundamental problem when the scheme comes forward if there's a cap at around 1,500?
Right.
Because there's obviously more, materially more than that on their own work.
Do you want to just go back over that? You've got this 60 hectare, 50 hectare, some of it being taken up by potentially the primary school and the.
Yeah, so the calculation, yes, it gives a degree of flexibility on the site, but in our calculations, we haven't, there is land that's required for the primary school, the secondary school, those things aren't included in that calculation. So they need to come off that 50 hectares that's left. So it would reduce that.
It was 60 and then you got down to 50 after you'd taken account of.
But that doesn't necessarily take into account all of the land that's required. We don't know how much land is required for a secondary school at the moment. So that's not included within that figure, we could look at standard sizes, but without that feasibility study, we've got no idea how much land is required. We don't know how big the health centre land is. So we've taken some of those things off that we do know, but we haven't done the whole of that calculation. That it gives a degree of flexibility over where things go and how many can go in what places. And
yeah, okay. I think, well, I will think about this, but there seems to be some doubts about the clear justification for a line that defines a developable area, both in terms of how the line has been drawn, in terms of physical topography and features on the site, and also the reason for the exact extent of that area and what that would mean for the implementation of the policy. I'm not saying that means that the justification for 1,500 isn't there. That may well still be right. It's just whether the policy needs to have a line drawn on a map to define what the development area is to accommodate that. So there's 2 different things. So I'll give that some thought. So I don't want to go over that too much, but yeah, okay. Thatcham Town Council.
Thank you, sir. So the Thatcham Strategic Growth Study appeared to be more of a sort of an assumption than a methodological analysis. So I draw your attention to the landscape sensitivity and capacity study for North East Thatcham, and particularly paragraph 1.7, which is in the executive summary, repeated in the conclusions. And this is on the capacity. It says that this exercise has concluded that overall the site THA 20 has a medium capacity. This is defined as that the site could accommodate areas of new development in some parts, providing it has regard to the setting and form of existing settlement, and goes on. In other words, the conclusion there doesn't appear to justify any particular number. Indeed, it doesn't appear to reach a conclusion that even 1,500 could be supported. And I would have thought, as a layperson, that that would be the document where you would find that analysis. Thank you.
I think what you're quoting from there is the landscape sensitivity capacity study, isn't it?
It says, it says and capacity, yes. And I'm assuming capacity is
Well,
what we're talking
I
about.
think then that is followed, that's in terms of landscape capacity, I
Okay.
think.
Yes.
And then that's followed through in further
Yes.
sort of site planning work
Yeah.
to think about
But
what those areas are and what you could physically
Okay.
fit on them, I think.
But it's, the report has been uncertain as to what areas could be used for that further work. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Well, okay, well, I think we'll leave that. Right, which brings me on to what I was just talking about, really. My next issue is 416 and 417. I mean, we may roll these together in effect, but these are about the maps. So you've got the policies map as submitted, and then the proposed changes to it. So as submitted, the policies map, which is the purpose of the policies map is to illustrate the geographical implementation of policies in the plan. So, and what it showed for this site was the extent of the allocation, the extent of the settlement boundary, which was the same thing. What was at that time called a country park, which is now a designation, is a phrase that has been proposed to be removed from the policy and replaced by a broader concept of this green infrastructure. So, and it showed some green links and a car park. So all of those things would have gone, and now the policies map would remind me what it would show as amended. Would it just be the allocation?
So it's got the allocation and then it shows the developable area and the green infrastructure buffer and the access point.
So that would be the same as the map that you'd appended to Appendix A, in Appendix A of your
Yes, that's correct.
yeah, okay. Right, okay. So there'd be exactly the same designations of the plan in the plan and the policies map.
Yes, that would
Yeah,
be correct.
fine. Right, okay, understood. Well, we've talked about the development area and the settlement boundary. An alternative approach, even if we were to indicate a development area, and I need to think about that and how it would be described, it could be indicative or something of that nature. But thinking about what I think we were talking about yesterday, was it earlier today or both? I can't remember. The position of the settlement boundary seems to be causing some ambiguity, confusion, or potentially unintended consequences. And I'm wondering whether an alternative approach would be, the approach in the submitted plan was to push the boundary out, but to say that's not its final position, it needs to be withdrawn once this work's been done. An alternative approach would it not be, and I think this may have been what Mr. Black was suggesting yesterday, to leave it where it is, i.e. in the adopted course strategy, is it? And say, turn it round, i.e. the same process that the settlement boundary will be redrawn once this policy SP17 has worked through in terms of the studies and the master planning process. And you could then draw a definitive settlement boundary around the new settlement edge. So it would take a tweak to the paragraph in the submitted plan to that effect. Would there be any, you don't have to decide a response to that now, but obviously then your allocation would be outside the settlement boundary. You may say, well, that is different from what you've done elsewhere, but this is a different situation, isn't it? Because the red line of the application site is not what you're envisaging to be developed, i.e. it's not where the settlement boundary would be. So do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the settlement boundary review criteria, which are Appendix 2 to the plan, talks about boundaries including residential sites allocated through the local plan and neighbourhood plan process. So that's why we feel it's important that the settlement boundary is defined.
Yes.
And we're acknowledging that round the whole of the site is not appropriate.
No.
And therefore, that's why we've tried to define, using the criteria in this appendix, where we think the settlement boundary is appropriate. It might be possible not to, but we'd have to you know, amend the wording of the policy to say it was, you know, contrary to that process, it was, you know, different and a different
Yeah.
approach had been taken, it would need clarification. Because it wouldn't then be consistent with how the other sites have been considered as allocations, because they are then within the settlement boundary.
Yes, and in a limited number of them, the settlement boundary is not contiguous with the allocation boundary. Is that, I mean, leaving aside Sandford Park, but are there one or two others where the settlement boundary reflects a development area, not the red line?
I need to check.
think Paul-
I'm not sure, but
Yeah. Yes. But, okay, but this could be an exception, couldn't it? I mean, it wouldn't prevent the implementation of this policy so long as the plan clearly explained what the process would be. If I think that the settlement boundary, drawing it now, is unhelpful to put it at the red line, but it's equally premature to try and define it for whatever reason now, an alternative approach would be that one. So, okay. Right, do you want to comment specifically on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir. So, I think the key wording relating to the settlement boundary is the definition in the glossary. And I think that definition is incompatible with putting the settlement boundary on the site boundary, because it says that identify the main area, built up area of the settlement within which development is considered acceptable in principle. And the policy is saying that part of that, the site is not in principle developable because it is what we loosely call the buffer. So I think that the proposal to have the settlement boundary following the red line of the site is not appropriate. I'm not entirely comfortable with setting it at a specific point at this time, but I'm less uncomfortable. But I think your suggestion that it should remain at the current position with a clear statement that it will be amended once a clear area is defined would be the best way forward, sir. Thank you.
Buckley.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just following on from that, really, we would concur with the views of Thatcham. I think also within that appendix 2 of the plan, it sets out what boundaries will exclude. And there's a list there that includes things like highly visible areas, such as exposed ridges, landforms, open slopes on the edge of settlements. This is all things that apply to these sites. So I agree that where it is at the moment in the plan as submitted is not right. I think we could make some peace with amending it later, given that there's a sort of level of ambiguity. But I think that could only really happen as part of a master plan process that the council would approve ahead of a submission of an application, because you have to have a point in which how does that boundary get set? Otherwise, I don't see how you can set a boundary through a planning application.
No, I think the boundary could only formally be set through a review of the plan, because
that could be years time.
But it would be retrospective then. It would reflect what the master plan had agreed and the application had ultimately then been approved. So that's how settlement boundaries for most settlements in the district are reflecting a reality on the ground, aren't they? That's, we had the discussion in week 1. They're not trying to do anything other than reflect the built form.
I don't think I like it.
Anyway,
I'm trying to find a solution that would, but I don't think that leaving it till a later local plan review would be right. I think there has to be a mechanism by which this is set, and it's not part of the planning application. But I'm afraid I don't have another solution for you.
well, I think my understanding of the policies map. Well, actually, we're getting into danger. The policies map. The way policies maps are updated is when plans are updated, and that's it. You don't go around changing policies maps at other times, irrespective of what the legal position may or may not be. That's normal practice. So you couldn't amend the policies map. You wouldn't amend the policies map if you adopted an SPD, for example. No, you're all shaking your heads.
Sorry, sir. The clarity from the parish council behind me. I think then it comes back to what we were talking about before, of that then becoming a strategic gap. And once you've set the development parameters, that you go through that loop that the council were talking about.
Okay, it's all there for me to plod my way through development gap as well. Okay, any other comments that people wish to make about well, I suppose the policies map and the map that would be in the plan, they're relative, I mean, they would be the same thing now. So it would just be an extract from the policies map in effect in the plan. We've debated as far as we can, I think, at this stage, what it should show in terms of the development area and the settlement boundary. And you've heard that. I mean, well, do you want to just have any quick observations on the process of setting the settlement
Not
boundary?
really. So no, I totally agree with what you said. And I mean, I think, you know, with some disquiet being expressed, most of the people who've spoken agree that your suggested potential alternative is the right.
We just need some careful wording to explain what that meant and why and what the implications were for the development of the site and go back to the whole process of the master planning process and whatever else.
Yeah.
So
No, we
it's
agree.
all part of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, right. So I've covered everything. Well, hopefully I've covered everything I want to cover, but I'm pretty sure I have on this site for now. So unless there's anything else that anybody wishes to say, I will just give the council the final opportunity to say anything. No, I think, I mean, obviously there are some things that I need to go away and think about. I think you've sort of acknowledged that there are some things that you need to think about. So what I will do in my usual way would be to write those down, I think, in essence, to whatever level of specificity I think is appropriate that I can give to provide guidance. But some of them I think are matters for the council to give consideration to, potentially in liaison with others on certain things. I won't try and go through a list now. I did yesterday afterwards, and there's a few things I've already got on it, and there's some more today. So I think the best thing is for me to set that out in the usual way. I may run through initial thoughts tomorrow morning because we're back tomorrow, not just to basically to give a heads up to the council. I'm not suggesting that anyone needs to come along to discuss that. It won't be really for discussion. It'll just be to give a brief, view of to the council, really. Okay, so yeah, Town Council.
One very minor point, sir. The policy SB 17 has a sentence referring to protection of the oil pipeline. The gas pipeline seems to have got overlooked until very recently, and I just ask whether that sentence should refer to the oil and the gas pipeline. I think it's a minor point, but if we refer to one, probably we should refer to both. It's the final sentence of the policy. Thank you.
Final sentence of the policy.
Starts a construction and operations management plan. Policy SB 17, unless it's been amended.
That's been amended. I'm
Okay.
looking at the appendix. Oh, I see, yeah. Yeah, I'll kind of leave that with you from today.
But yeah, we can have a look at it.
Okay. Right, okay, well, thank you. Oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry, sir. Forgive me. Just in terms of things, I'm not going to repeat any of our points from today. The things that you might ask the council to consider. The one thing that, even though we've been focusing on the site itself and capacity and so on today, that lingered from yesterday that I kept thinking about and we kept thinking about during today, was the point about whether having a cap or thereabouts at 1,500 really does the trick in terms of a strategic site looking beyond the plan period. And I think that was always there in all of the work and all the justification for the strategic site at 2,500. And it's just absent. It's just absent from the council's current case. And that, thinking about soundness and the framework, seems to us, even though we were focusing today on the detail, to be a big point. And it's not the forum for asking direct questions of the council, but that seems to us to be something that we really think that they haven't grappled with properly and maybe should do.
Mm. Okay, yes, I'll have a think. I mean, I think one of my early questions was to seek clarification of what the policy was intending to say, because the way it was phrased was the site is allocated, or is to be allocated. This was originally, is to be allocated for approximately 1,500 dwellings, which will be completed within the plan period of the plan. Which, you know, to my mind, raised the question, well, does that mean that's the end of it or not? And so.
And I remember the exchange there,
Yeah.
and I won't characterise how it went, but it's not, I think it's still an open question, that one. And if you think about even if one takes it to be clear, as written at the moment, that it's just the plan, period, the real question, it seems to us, in relation to the framework is that right? Is that sound as a way of doing the plan? That's the point that I'm just pushing, I think, because it's a big point that maybe hasn't been answered by the council.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, we'll leave it for today. Yeah, thank you. Okay, right. Okay, yeah.
Just to clarify that the sentence I was referring to was the final sentence. The same text has been moved up to the section on sustainability.
Yeah, I realise that. Yes, thank you.
You want to wrap up, sir?
No, I'm not particularly any rush. If we continue.
Well, I won't take long.
We've got another couple of hours if you want.
I think actually on the opposite side of the coin, we are also keen that clarity is brought into your final reports, that if this is going to be found sound, and 1,500 or whatever, there needs to be clarity as to what exactly is going to be developed on this site for residents in the communities that I'm acting for. And another element of that this is effectively reaching across the table here, in that there may be some work that the parties can do together whilst you're carrying on with the examination, in terms of thinking around what a master plan might look like, the process in which and the scope of such a document, that may be something that can be presented to you in a form of common ground and set out what the matters of agreement are and what the matters of disagreement are, that may assist you in thinking about that. Because from our perspective, sir, if you are going to find this, you have our positions, but equally looking ahead here around what might happen next, and if a plan was found sound, there needs to be some certainty from our point of view.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by what a master plan might look like. I don't know if you're talking about what.
I'm not talking about what it physically looks like. I'm talking about the scope of such a master plan.
Right.
That might come in, because at the moment you've been given some different parts today that are all new, and the points made over this side are correct, that it's not something that we've seen in advance of.
What's it? Sorry.
Well, in terms of what the council was saying to you in terms of a master plan and the sequencing of that.
The process.
A lot of that is new. It's not in evidence in front of you.
Yeah.
What we're saying to you, sir, is that I think that's new to us as well. Okay, and I think there's a lot of certainty that would need to come into that, and it may assist you if the parties had talked about that.
Yeah. In terms of seeking, I need to think about it, but one of the things I probably will need clarification on is what the sequencing or the process is intended to be, and get, then there'll be some discussion about that in some form or another. So yes. Okay, thank you. Right, we'll end day for today unless anybody's got anything else. So tomorrow, some of us are back with Sandalford Park and the non-strategic allocations in the Newbury Thatcham area, and the council's response to the action point about the other potentially suitable and available non-strategic allocations in that area, of which there are, I think, 3 on your list. Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you all.